Otis Redding, the voice that never heard its greatest song. You know the song. You know the whistle? You know, sitting on the dock of the bay. But you don't know the whistle was never supposed to be there. His father contracted tuberculosis and couldn't work, so Otis dropped out of school at 15 to dig wells. He won a local talent contest, 15 consecutive weeks until they banned him from entering. His entire recording career started because another musician session ended early, and there were 40 minutes of leftover studio time. He married a 15-year-old girl and bought her a 300-acre ranch. He wrote Respect, then watched Aretha Franklin take it from him and turn it into someone else's anthem. He conquered the whitest audience in America at Monterey Pop Festival by playing a Rolling Stones song like a gospel revival. 3 days before he died, he recorded a song he couldn't finish. The whistling at the end was a placeholder for lyrics he never wrote. Then he boarded a twin-engine plane in fog so thick the pilot couldn't see the lake beneath him. 7 of 8 people on that plane died in water so cold their muscles seized within minutes. The sole survivor, a 20-year-old trumpet player, clung to a seat cushion and listened to his teenage bandmates screaming in the dark around him. One by one, the voices stopped. Otis Redding was 26 years old. He didn't even make the 27 club. Every word of this is documented. 10 moments, all verified. This is Otis Redding's real story. Number 10. His father got tuberculosis, and Otis dropped out at 15 to dig wells. Otis Ray Redding Jr. was born on September 9, 1941 in Dawson, Georgia, a farming town in Terrell County where black families worked white-owned land and kept almost nothing. His father, Otis Redding Sr., was a deacon and sharecropper who moved the family to Macon, Georgia, when Otis was 3. The elder Redding found steady work at Robins Air Force Base, a government job that kept 6 children fed and housed in the Tyndall Heights Housing Project, a public housing complex for black families on Macon's south side. Then Otis Sr. contracted tuberculosis. The Air Force Base let him go. In the 1950s, tuberculosis in a black family in Georgia meant isolation, poverty, and shame. Otis Sr. spent stretches bedridden or in treatment, while Fannie Mae Redding, Otis's mother, took domestic jobs that paid almost nothing. There were 6 children to feed. The rent on their Tyndall Heights unit was minimal but relentless. Every dollar mattered, and most months there weren't enough of them. Otis Jr. dropped out of Ballard-Hudson High School at 15. He found work digging wells, hauling rock and dirt in Georgia heat for wages that barely covered groceries. He pumped gas, he washed cars, he took whatever manual labor a black teenager in Macon could find. He handed his earnings to his mother. Every dollar went to keeping the family alive. But every Sunday, Otis sang in the choir at Vineville Baptist Church. His voice was enormous, raw, untrained. It filled the small building like something trying to escape through the walls. Fellow congregants said you could hear him from the parking lot. His mother encouraged him. His father, when he was well enough to attend services, sat and listened, and said nothing. Otis later told interviewers he never resented leaving school. School didn't teach him anything he needed. What he needed was to keep his family from starving. Music was something else entirely. Music wasn't survival. Music was the thing that made survival bearable. Within a year of dropping out, he'd found a way to turn that voice into cash. But first, he had to win the same contest 15 times in a row. Number 9. He won a talent contest 15 straight weeks until they banned him. The Douglas Theater on Broadway in Macon was the center of black cultural life in Middle Georgia. Every Sunday, disc jockey Hamp Swain hosted an amateur talent contest where local singers, dancers, and musicians competed for a $5 prize. $5 in 1957 was groceries for the week. For a 16-year-old handing every paycheck to his mother, it was a fortune. Otis entered and won. He came back the next week and won again. Then the next. And the next. 15 consecutive Sundays singing Little Richard covers, Sam Cooke ballads, and gospel standards with a voice that overwhelmed every other contestant on the stage. Other performers stopped signing up. There was no point competing against a teenager who sang like a grown man on fire. After 15 straight victories, Hamp Swain told Otis he was done. He couldn't enter anymore. The decision wasn't punishment. It was mercy for every other aspiring singer in Macon who deserved a chance. Swain later recalled telling Otis he had to let somebody else win, but Swain also recognized what he had. He started connecting Otis to local musicians, understanding that the kid had long outgrown Sunday amateur hours. The band pushed Otis toward Johnny Jenkins and the Pine Toppers, a local R&B band that played fraternity parties and juke joints across Georgia. Otis became their driver first, their occasional vocalist second. Jenkins was the frontman, a flashy left-handed guitarist who commanded attention. Otis drove the van, hauled equipment, set up amps, and waited for his turn at the microphone. He waited 2 years. When his chance finally came, it arrived by accident, in a recording studio 400 miles from Macon, because somebody else's session fell apart. Number 8. His entire career started because another musician's session ended early. In October 1962, Johnny Jenkins had a recording session booked at Stax Records in Memphis, Tennessee. Stax was a small independent label run by Jim Stewart and his sister Estelle Axton, out of a converted movie theater on East McLemore Avenue. Atlantic Records, Stax's distribution partner, wanted to hear what Jenkins could do in a proper studio. There was one logistical problem. Jenkins didn't have a driver's license. Otis Redding, his 21-year-old driver and occasional singer, drove the band 7 hours from Macon to Memphis in a station wagon stuffed with instruments. Jenkins' session collapsed. He couldn't nail his takes. The songs weren't working. After roughly 2 hours, Jim Stewart called it. The session was done. But 30 to 40 minutes of paid studio time remained. The musicians were still there. The tape was still loaded. The clock was still running. Otis asked if he could use what was left. Stewart was reluctant. He didn't know this kid. He'd never heard him sing. But Steve Cropper and the other Stax House musicians who'd been watching Otis sit quietly in the corner all afternoon urged Stewart to let him try. The time was paid for. What was there to lose? Otis sat down at the piano. He played a simple chord progression and began singing a ballad he'd written called "These Arms of Mine." His voice cracked and strained with emotion. The song was a plié, a desperate love letter from a man who had nothing to offer except the sheer force of what he felt. He cut it in 2 takes. Jim Stewart wasn't sold. He thought the song was too slow, too raw, too far from anything on the radio. But Estelle Axton heard the playback through the shop wall and told her brother he was wrong. She said women would buy that record. She was right. These Arms of Mine was released in early 1963 and crept up the R&B charts to number 20. It sold enough to justify a second session, then a third, then an album, then a career. Every song Otis Redding ever recorded, Try a Little Tenderness, I've Been Loving You Too Long, Respect, Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, exists because Johnny Jenkins couldn't drive and his session ended early. 40 minutes of someone else's leftover time created a legend. But Otis had already made another decision, a year before that studio session, that would anchor everything that followed. Number 7. He married a 15-year-old girl and built her a ranch. On August 17, 1961, Otis Redding married Zelma Atwood in Macon, Georgia. He was 19, she was 15. In rural Georgia in 1961, marriages involving teenage girls were legal with parental consent, and Zelma's family approved. By Tyndall Heights standards, Otis was a strong prospect, hardworking, church-going, devoted to family, and already earning side money with the Pine Toppers on weekends. They moved into a small apartment in Macon. Their first son, Dexter, had been born in 1960 before the wedding. Otis III arrived in 1962. A daughter, Carla, followed in 1963. By the time These Arms of Mine hit the charts, Otis was a 21-year-old husband and father of 3, whose career might or might not survive past the next single. When real money finally came, touring money, royalty checks, publishing advances, Otis did something nobody in Tyndall Heights could have predicted. He bought a 300-acre ranch in Round Oak, Georgia, about 30 miles from Macon. He called it the Big O Ranch. He raised cattle, horses, and hogs. He built a house for Zelma and the children. He installed a swimming pool. He bought a tractor and drove it himself. Red Georgia clay under his fingernails. The Big O Ranch was Otis's proof that poverty was behind him. He told friends that if the music stopped tomorrow, he'd be a farmer. He meant it. He loved the land with the intensity of a man whose father had worked someone else's soil his entire life. Otis owned his soil. 300 acres of Georgia dirt belonging to a black man in the 1960s Deep South. That meant something no hit record could match. Zelma ran the ranch when Otis toured, which was constantly, sometimes 300 shows a year. She managed the books, handled the livestock, and raised 3 children essentially alone. Otis called home every night, but calls aren't presents. He told her 1968 would be different. He'd slow down, spend time at the ranch, watch the kids grow, maybe produce other artists instead of grinding through another year on the road. He made that promise in November 1967. He had 3 weeks left to live. Number 6, he wrote Respect. Then Aretha Franklin took it from him. In 1965, Otis Redding wrote and recorded Respect. His version was a working man's demand, a husband coming home after a long day, telling his woman to give him what he'd earned. The song reached number 35 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 4 on the R&B chart. It was a solid hit, not a phenomenon, a solid hit. 2 years later, Aretha Franklin walked into Atlantic Records studio in New York and recorded the same song. She didn't just cover it, she rebuilt it from the ground up. She changed the perspective from a man's demand to a woman's declaration. She added the spelled out R-E-S-P-E-C-T hook, the sock it to me backing vocals, and a vocal performance that sounded like liberation itself. Her version hit number 1 on both the pop and R&B charts in June 1967 and became an anthem for the civil rights movement and the feminist movement simultaneously. Otis's version was essentially erased from public memory. He handled it with a grace that masked something more complicated. At live shows, he started introducing the song by acknowledging what had happened. He'd tell audiences a girl had taken his song away from him, a friend of his. She just took it, but he was going to do it anyway. The crowds laughed. Otis smiled. Then he sang his version with everything he had, pouring enough raw power into it to remind everyone the song had been his first. Jerry Wexler, who produced Aretha's version at Atlantic, later acknowledged the uncomfortable truth. Aretha's Respect became one of the most important recordings of the 20th century. It transcended music. It became political, cultural, generational. And it was built on a foundation Otis Redding laid. He wrote the melody. He wrote the chord changes. He wrote the original lyric. Aretha transformed it into something larger, but the blueprint was his. Otis reportedly told friends he was proud of Aretha's version. He also reportedly said, with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, that the next time he wrote a song that good, he'd keep it to himself. The paradox followed him throughout his career. Black radio embraced him, but some black audiences found his shouting style old-fashioned next to Motown's polished elegance. White radio largely ignored him because program directors wouldn't play records by black artists who sounded too raw, Too southern, too uncompromising. He existed in a commercial no man's land. Too intense for pop, too gritty for the mainstream, writing songs that became anthems only after other people recorded them. But then a festival in California gave him 50,000 white listeners who'd never heard him before. And Otis made a decision that proved he understood audiences better than anyone alive. Number 5. He conquered Monterey by playing a Rolling Stones song like a gospel revival. On Saturday evening, June 17, 1967, Otis Redding walked onto the stage at the Monterey International Pop Festival. The crowd stretched to 50,000, overwhelmingly white, draped in tie-dye and flowers, there to see Jefferson Airplane, The Who, and Jimi Hendrix. Most of them had never seen Otis perform live. Many had never heard his records at all. He was the only major soul act on the bill. Otis was terrified. Jerry Wexler later recalled Otis calling him the week before Monterey, asking whether he should go through with it. The audience would be almost entirely white. They wouldn't know his catalog. They might sit on their hands the way some Apollo crowds had before he'd won them over. Wexler told him to go. He said it would be the most important performance of his life. Otis opened with Shake, a high-energy screamer that grabbed the crowd by the collar. Then came Respect, reintroduced to an audience that only knew Aretha's version. Then I've Been Loving You Too Long, delivered as a slow-burning plea that silenced the field. But the masterstroke came when he played I Can't Get No Satisfaction. Every person in that audience knew the Rolling Stones original by heart. Otis took their song and remade it as a soul testification. Horns blazing, rhythm section driving, his voice turning Mick Jagger's sardonic sneer into something urgent and physical. The crowd erupted. He'd reached across the racial divide by taking a song they already loved and showing them what it sounded like with its chest cracked open. He closed with Try a Little Tenderness, building the song from a whispered ballad into a screaming, horn-driven frenzy that left the entire field on its feet. He repeated, got to try, while the band hammered harder and harder until the song detonated. Mid-set, he leaned into the microphone and asked, "This is the love crowd, right?" 50,000 hippies screamed yes. Festival co-producer Lou Adler later said, 3 performances at Monterey changed everything. He named Ravi Shankar, Jimi Hendrix, and Otis Redding. Backstage, other musicians watched with their jaws slack. The man who couldn't get on white pop radio had just stolen the biggest festival of 1967. The performance was captured by Dia Pennebaker's cameras and included in the Monterey Pop documentary. It introduced Otis to millions of white Americans who'd never heard of him. Album sales surged, booking offers multiplied. The commercial wall that had kept him off pop radio for 5 years was finally cracking. He had 6 months to exploit the breakthrough. He used nearly every day of it. And in the final weeks, he wrote a song unlike anything he'd ever attempted. Quiet, reflective, almost resigned. A song about sitting still, from a man who never sat still. He couldn't finish it in time. Number 4. He recorded Dock of the Bay, and the whistling was never supposed to stay. In November 1967, Otis Redding rented a houseboat in Sausalito, California, across the bay from San Francisco. He was recovering from throat surgery and taking a rare break from the road. He sat on the deck, watched the ships drift through the fog, and started writing. He brought the unfinished idea to Steve Cropper at Stax in Memphis. Cropper, the guitarist who'd co-written dozens of the label's biggest hits, heard something new. This wasn't a screamer. It wasn't a pleading ballad. It was reflective, melancholy, almost still, completely unlike anything Otis had ever recorded. The lyrics described a man sitting on a dock watching the tide roll in, wasting time. For a performer defined by explosive physical energy, the song was a radical act of restraint. They recorded Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay on November 22, 1967, at the Stax Studio in Memphis. Otis returned on December 7th to overdub final parts. During that session, they reached the end of the song, and Otis didn't have lyrics for the outro. The melody was there, the feeling was there, the words weren't. So Otis whistled, a simple, wandering, haunting phrase over the fade-out, while seagull sound effects drifted underneath. Cropper later said it was a placeholder. Otis planned to come back after his next run of tour dates and write real lyrics for the ending. They'd finish it then. Neither of them considered the possibility that December 7 would be the last time Otis Redding ever stood in front of a studio microphone. Cropper recalled that Otis was excited about the song but uncertain. It sounded nothing like Try a Little Tenderness or Respect. He worried fans would reject the stillness of it, the quietness. Cropper told him it was the best thing he'd ever written. Otis laughed and said they'd finish it properly when he got back from the road. He never got back. After Otis died, Cropper faced a decision alone in the Stax control room. The whistling was temporary, a sketch. Should he cut it? Hire a session singer to add words? Leave the ending incomplete? He left it. The placeholder became the most recognizable ending in the history of recorded music. A man trailing off into the distance, whistling because he'd run out of words, not knowing he'd also run out of time. The unfinished song became, in its incompleteness, a perfect expression of everything that was about to happen. 3 days after that final session, Otis boarded a plane. Number 3. The pilot flew into fog with a plane full of teenagers. On the morning of December 10, 1967, Otis Redding and his band boarded a twin-engine Beechcraft H-18 at Cleveland Hopkins International Airport. They'd performed the previous night at Leo's Casino in Cleveland and had a show that evening at a club called The Factory in Madison, Wisconsin. The flight was roughly 500 miles. The plane belonged to Otis. He'd purchased it as his career grew, tired of missed connections and commercial airline delays. The pilot was Richard Fraser. On board were 6 members of Otis's orbit: Phelan Jones, the Bar-Kays saxophonist, a teenager; Carl Cunningham, their drummer, 18 years old; Ronnie Caldwell, organist, barely into his 20s; Jimmy King, guitarist, 18; Matthew Kelly, Otis's valet and road manager; and Ben Cauley, the Bar-Kays trumpet player, 20 years old. 8 souls total, including the pilot and Otis. James Alexander, the Bar-Kays bassist, was not on the plane. He'd traveled to Madison separately that morning. That decision saved his life. The weather over south central Wisconsin was deteriorating. Fog crept in off the lakes. Visibility collapsed. Light rain mixed with ice in the clouds. Conditions were marginal for instrument approaches, dangerous for anything less. The Beechcraft H-18 was a workhorse aircraft, but it was not built for what waited over Madison. At 3:28 p.m. Central Time, approximately 4 miles from the Madison airport, the plane descended into Lake Monona. There was no Mayday call, no distress signal, no radio communication indicating trouble. The aircraft simply dropped below radar altitude and struck the water. The impact was catastrophic. The plane broke apart on contact with the surface. Water temperature in Lake Monona that afternoon was approximately 34 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, muscles begin to lock within minutes. Voluntary movement becomes impossible within 5 to 10 minutes. Unconsciousness follows shortly after. Ben Cauley, the 20-year-old trumpet player, later described the moment. He said he unbuckled his seatbelt as water rushed into the cabin. He fought through the wreckage to the surface and grabbed a seat cushion. He was in the water, in the fog, in the cold, alone. Then he heard screaming, voices in the fog around him, his bandmates, teenagers he'd been playing music with the night before, calling for help in water that was killing them. He couldn't see anyone. The fog was impenetrable, the water black. He heard them crying out, thrashing, trying to stay above the surface as their bodies shut down. One by one, the voices faded. One by one, they stopped. Cauley clung to the seat cushion. A rescue boat reached him sometime later. Hypothermic, barely conscious, the sole survivor. He was pulled from the water and rushed to Madison General Hospital. Otis Redding's body was recovered from the lake the next day, still strapped into his seat. Phelan Jones, Carl Cunningham, Ronnie Caldwell, Jimmy King, Matthew Kelly, and Richard Fraser were recovered over the following days. 7 dead, 1 alive, 4 miles from the runway. The FAA investigation found no mechanical failure. The probable cause was cited as the pilot's descent below safe altitude during instrument meteorological conditions. Fraser may have lost spatial orientation in the fog. He may have misjudged his altitude over the featureless lake surface. The investigation could not determine what happened in the cockpit during the final seconds, because the only person who could have explained it was dead. What is certain, a twin-engine plane carrying one of the greatest singers in American history and a band of teenagers flew into fog over a freezing Wisconsin lake, and 7 of 8 people aboard never came out of the water alive. Number 2. Ben Cauley carried the screaming for 48 years. Ben Cauley was 20 years old when he surfaced in Lake Monona and heard his friends dying in the dark around him. He was the only person who walked away from the crash that killed Otis Redding. He spent the next 48 years living with what that meant. In the weeks after the crash, Cauley was hospitalized for hypothermia and shock. He didn't attend the funerals. He couldn't. His body healed within weeks. His mind never did. He returned to music because he didn't know what else to do. He played with Memphis acts throughout the 1970s and 1980s. He eventually rejoined a reconstituted version of the Bar-Kays alongside James Alexander, the bassist who'd survived by taking a different flight. But in interviews, Cauley said the same thing for decades. He heard the screaming every night, not as a metaphor. He heard it in sleep, in silence, in the gaps between songs. The sound of teenagers calling out in freezing water never left him. He described it to the Memphis Commercial Appeal in 2003. He said he could hear them in the water calling out. Then the voices stopped, one at a time. He said that sound was always with him. It never went away. Cauley struggled with depression and substance abuse for years. Friends described survivors' guilt that operated like a physical weight pressing on his chest. Why him? Why did the trumpet player live when the 18-year-old saxophonist drowned? Why did he grab a seat cushion while Otis stayed buckled to his seat? Why was he floating when everybody else was sinking? There were no answers. There never would be. The Bar-Kays who died that day were barely old enough to vote. Phelan Jones and Carl Cunningham were 18. Jimmy King was 18. Ronnie Caldwell was the eldest at around 20. Their debut single, Soul Finger, had reached number 17 on the pop chart just months earlier. They were teenagers on the verge of real careers, playing behind one of the biggest stars in soul music, and they died in 34-degree water, 4 miles from a runway they never saw. Their instruments sank to the bottom of Lake Monona. Some were never recovered. Ben Cauley died on September 21st, 2015, in Memphis. He was 67. He'd outlived Otis by nearly 48 years. He spent those 48 years hearing 3 minutes of freezing water, voices of teenagers who never grew up, played on a loop inside his skull that no amount of time or therapy or music could silence. At his funeral, James Alexander delivered the eulogy. He told mourners that Ben never got over that lake. He said Ben talked about it constantly, carried it every day. He watched his friend bear that weight for almost half a century, and it never got lighter. 1 seat cushion. That was the margin. one seat cushion between survival and the bottom of a Wisconsin lake. Number 1. The first posthumous number 1, and the song he never heard. Sitting on the Dock of the Bay was released on January 8, 1968, 29 days after Otis Redding's body was pulled from Lake Monona. On March 16, 1968, it reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It was the first posthumous number 1 single in American chart history. Otis never heard the finished mix. He never heard the seagull effects Steve Cropper added after his death. He never heard the final master with the whistling he'd intended to replace. He never knew the placeholder became the hook. He never knew the song he worried was too different, too quiet, too unlike him would become the biggest hit of his career by an enormous margin, outselling everything he'd ever released in his lifetime combined. The song spent 4 weeks at number 1 and sold millions of copies worldwide. It crossed every barrier that had kept Otis off mainstream radio for 5 years. White stations played it, black stations played it, country stations played it. The raw, shouting, too intense soul man who couldn't crack the pop top 20 while he was alive became inescapable the moment he was gone. Steve Cropper finished the final mix alone in the Stax control room, adding guitar fills and atmospheric touches to a recording made by a man who no longer existed. He later said it was the hardest thing he ever did in a studio. He kept expecting Otis to walk through the door and tell him to change something. The door stayed closed. The success of Dock of the Bay created a paradox so cruel it defined everything that followed. Otis spent 5 years fighting for crossover acceptance, 300 shows a year, European tours where British audiences treated him like royalty while American radio pretended he didn't exist, Monterey where he proved to 50,000 people that soul music could command a rock festival. 5 years of relentless, grinding, body-destroying work aimed at a single goal: reaching the audience that was right there, waiting, but blocked by an industry that wouldn't let a black man from Georgia onto pop radio without smoothing his edges first. He broke through, but only after he was dead. Phil Walden, his manager, later said Otis was on the verge. Everything was about to open up. Monterey had cracked the door. Dock of the Bay would have torn it off its hinges. If Otis had lived 6 more months, Walden believed, he would have been the biggest artist on the planet. Instead, the biggest hit of his career played on every radio station in America, while his family stood on a hillside at the Big O Ranch and lowered his casket into red Georgia clay. 4,000 people attended the funeral on December 18, 1967 at the Macon City Auditorium. Jerry Wexler eulogized him. Joe Tex wept in the front row. James Brown sat in silence. Little Richard sang. Booker T. Jones played organ. The Stax House Band, the musicians who'd built every groove Otis ever wrote, performed one final time for the man who'd walked into their studio with 40 minutes of borrowed time and changed their lives. Zelma Redding stood with their 3 children. Dexter was 7. Otis III was 5. Carla was 4. Zelma was 21 years old. She'd been married to Otis since she was 15. He'd promised her 1968 would be different. He'd promised to slow down, stay home, work the ranch, watch the children grow. She buried him on the land he'd bought to prove he'd escape poverty forever. Otis Ray Redding Jr., September 9, 1941. December 10, 1967. 26 years, 3 months, and 1 day. Otis Redding recorded professionally for 5 years. He was famous for 4. His crossover to mainstream American success lasted exactly 0 days of his conscious life. The song that made him immortal was released a month after he died. Built on a whistle he never meant to keep, mixed by a guitarist working alone in a studio that still echoed with a voice that would never return. He dropped out of school at 15 to dig wells so his family could eat. He won a talent show so many times they banned him from the stage. He got his entire career from 40 minutes of another man's failed session. He married a teenage girl and bought her a ranch with money earned from singing songs other people turned into bigger hits. He conquered Monterey with someone else's song played like nobody else could play it. He recorded a masterpiece he never heard finished. Then he climbed into a small plane with a band of teenagers and flew into fog 4 miles from safety. Ben Cauley heard the screaming for 48 years. Steve Cropper finished the mix alone. Zelma buried her husband at 21 and raised 3 children on a ranch built by a dead man's royalties. The Bar-Kays lost 4 members who weren't old enough to rent a car. Sittin' On. The Dock of the Bay has been streamed and broadcast billions of times. The whistle that was supposed to be temporary became the most famous fade-out in recorded music. A placeholder for words that were never written, sung by a man who ran out of time 4 miles from a Wisconsin runway in fog so thick the pilot never saw the water that killed them. 26 years old, 3 children, 300 acres. 1 seat cushion between surviving and the bottom of a lake. The greatest soul singer who ever lived never heard his greatest song. Which moment hit hardest? The 15 straight wins at the Douglas Theater? 40 minutes of leftover studio time creating an entire legacy? Ben Cauley hearing the voices stop one by one? The whistle that was never supposed to stay? Drop a comment. And if you want more stories about the legends you thought you knew, subscribe. There's a lot more coming.